It's a training aid. Whatever you do, understand on it. Please don't. Okay. Bear with me a second. Which one am I pressing? Helps if we got it the right way up. Okay, here we go. Thank you for the opportunity for me being here this afternoon. My apologies, ne mluvím moc česky, budu česky jenom trošku, okay? So it's going to have to be in English, I'm afraid, but we've got some translation, so I have to be careful what I say. I'm an ex-British Army combat medic. I'm registered as a paramedic. To cut a long story short, I've been a medic in various guises for about the last 30 years. So I started off my education in medicine when I was about 16 years of age, and that's when I joined the Army. I joined the British Army, Army College, and basically I am where I am today. I'm kind of leading on where my colleague just left off. I'm going to talk about bombs. This is my story, or a recollection of incidents that occurred in Kuwait during the period 1991-92. Things I'm going to talk about are based on my own experience and my education of combat medicine at that time. And as you already know from what people have said over the course of the last couple of days, medicine has developed, certainly military medicine. And back then, arguably, it was very basic. And the medical techniques that I go through are for use, obviously, in extreme circumstances. You could definitely argue where I was extreme. Certainly, my practice of medicine was extreme. I have sought permission of people before I've made some of these slides. Unfortunately, I can't show all of the pictures of the incidents that I'm going to talk about for legal reasons, because we have to protect people, and unfortunately things are going through court. So I've done the best I possibly can. The idea being I'm going to share my experiences with you, and hopefully provide an understanding of the devastating effects of another method of warfare, which is landmines. So my previous colleague talked about improvised explosive devices. The devices I'm going to talk about are man-made, designed to maim or kill an enemy. First of all, we need to understand what a battlefield is. And to be honest, most people don't. Most people think it's a group of guys shooting at each other with rifles and a few rockets. It's a lot more than that. If anybody's ever read The Art of War, that's a book you want to read. How do we define a battlefield? As a piece of ground on which a battle is or was fought. Was being the operative term, because I was in a battlefield after a war, but arguably wars continue even after you think they've finished. It's a place or situation of strife or conflict. So as I said, during the period 1991 to 93, I was involved in explosive ordnance disposal operations in Kuwait and Iraq. I was the team medic for a team most commonly known as Mike 4. That was our call sign. And our task was to find the things that were hidden, that were lying dormant, waiting to maim or kill. And unfortunately they did, and they were very good at it. Landmines are a weapon. I have a landmine here. And if I know what I'm doing, and I follow the render safe procedure, I can dispose of this relatively safely. Unfortunately, if you expose these weapons to extremes of environment, extreme heat and extreme cold, unfortunately they get a little bit temperamental and they tend to do their own thing, which is not a good thing. So when you have an area that's planted with explosive mines, it's obviously described as a minefield. Some people would describe life as a minefield. We're forever tiptoeing our way through it, trying to navigate the safest of the right route. unfortunately, 80% of landmine casualties are civilian. Because mines, unfortunately, are a legacy of war, and they're most often left behind long after the war is over. So how is mine clearance fighting? Because we're not shooting at each other, certainly not actively anyway. Unfortunately, we never actually know 100% if our next move is going to be our last. Especially when you have something that contains a very small amount of metal. This is actually a transit plug, it's not the detonator. But the detonator would be located in the bottom of this Italian-made VS-50 anti-personnel last mine, and arguably the only piece of metal in it is approximately a couple of centimeters long. So you can imagine how difficult this is to find with a mine detector. Oh, and it floats as well. We were expected, certainly when we were working in Kuwait and Iraq, to work in temperatures of plus 55 degrees centigrade. And we were wearing bomb suits, etc. at the same time, which means your work is very limited in terms of time. And of course, unfortunately, my job as a medic was fighting to keep somebody alive when it all went wrong. Good. So here we go. These are some of the mines we encountered. Most of these are made in Italy, made in Europe. One there, the large one, the Iraqi cast mine, that was made in Iraq. The two at the top, the little black one, the little green one, they're Chinese. Apart from that, the other ones are made in Europe. As you can see, they can be disguised very well. Now, when we go back to a war zone, when we go back to a battlefield and we remove all of the remnants of war, it's a humanitarian act. It's part of re-stabilization, rebuilding countries, because the idea is once these are sown, we have to be able to remove them. And the Geneva Convention does actually cover the use of mines. Certainly in Kuwait and Iraq, the Iraqis at that time had some advice and had to lay the mines in a certain way, which made it a lot easier for the Allies to supposedly come along and be able to clean them up. Unfortunately, the desert doesn't make it that simple, so we had lots of challenges. Either way, all of the incidents that I'm going to talk about, the ones that I was involved in, are all recorded. You'll find them recorded here, held in the Global Conventional Weapons Destruction Repository, and that's established by the Center for International Stabilization and Recovery, James Madison University in Virginia, USA. So obviously from last lecture you got a little bit of information with regards to blast injury. And there are several phases to a blast. All of them will kill you. Primary is the blast force itself. Secondary, you're going to have missiles, anything, debris, fragmentation from the device. Tertiary would be impact on hard surfaces, because inevitably people get blown off their feet. And then not forgetting the hot gases and the fire and everything else. So at that time, this is some of the personal protective equipment that we were using. You cannot clear landmines when you're dressed in a full body suit with air conditioning in the helmet, etc. Think kind of hurt locker. It doesn't work like that, especially when you're working in 50 plus degrees centigrade and you need manual dexterity to be able to find things. So this is typical of the equipment that we were using. So, as engineers, we were assigned to clear certain areas, and actually allies were given areas that they would be responsible for. We were responsible for what was most commonly known as the Southern Triangle. In fact, we actually made our way all the way up from Saudi Arabia to the Iraqi border. So we pretty much cleared the whole of what was cleared as the demilitarized zone. Either way, we had a lot of information. As you can imagine, we had a lot of propaganda, a lot of materials that were passed out to civilians, warning them not to touch. Remember the 80% statistic. And in terms of medevac, it was extremely limited. We didn't have the helicopters and systems that we have in place right now. Well, we had a helicopter if we were lucky. Bearing in mind, oil wells and oil fields had been set alight, so daytime had been turned into nighttime, pretty much 24 hours, which meant flying was extremely limited, especially when you have oil in the air, and obviously that affects aircraft when they're flying. If you were a medic and you had a form of transport, you would be the med in the evac. So we wouldn't have people, extra paramedics, extra medics brought to us, we would be on the ground. So if you were lucky, you had your own vehicle. Sometimes we didn't, we would actually have to hitch a lift, throw our medical equipment in the back of a Land Rover, and off we would go. And as I said, remember, this is 1991. So we're not talking about tourniquets, we're not talking about junctional tourniquets, we've got no hemostatic agents, no such thing as TXA, we've got no blood products, and if we did have evacuation, it was going to be long. As if we didn't have enough problems. So I'm going to look at 3 incidents that I was involved in. The first one was in November of 1991. The accident, I was there if you want to look it up, and it involved an Italian Valmara 69 anti-personnel fragmentation mine, or BFrag, blast fragmentation. It involved 2 casualties, both of those were British, and they were minefield operators or clearance operators. So here we have a picture of a mine that's strapped to a metal stake, and it was actually part of beach defences. So the Iraqis thought that the Allies were going to raid the beaches, do a Normandy, but in Iraq, and they put these defences up. Of course it didn't happen. We drove up from Saudi. Here's an idea of the beach defences. So, again, lots of these, and we're talking thousands upon thousands of these, as well as other types of anti-personnel mine are buried in the sand. This is a public beach, or at least that's what the Kuwaitis want after we've been there and done our job. So this is typically what it looked like. And our job was to go and find mines. So here we've got 2 operators that are with my team. You've got the guy that's locating the mine, and you have a choice. You locate the mine with the minesweeper, or should I say you locate the metal stake, and then you've kind of got to figure out which end is going to be the end with the mine. And sometimes it's difficult to tell. Either way, you may have to dig 2.5, 3 feet to try and find the mine. Now, because they were rather precarious, we wouldn't remove them by hand, we would blow them in situ. So in this particular incident, the operator, his name was Chris. Unfortunately, he was a very good friend of mine, which makes it hard to kind of deal with because it becomes personal. He located the metal post with the mine attached, and it was buried in the sand. And unfortunately, the sand was wet, certainly in the level of the depth that he dug down to, and the tide was coming in. So we had a limited period of time that we could stay on the beach. It's believed during the course of the investigation that Chris fell into the hole, and he functioned the mine at the end of it. Only the day before, we put standard operating procedures in place because I wasn't happy about what we would do if there was an accident. I'd literally only been in country a week, maybe 2 weeks. I was very green, very naive, didn't want to upset anybody, especially when you've got officers and senior NCOs of a higher rank of you, and they expect you to shut up, put up, and do your job when you need to do it. Unfortunately, I didn't quite do that. I complained, went to my boss, said, "Boss, I'm really not happy. We've got no procedures. If somebody gets hurt in the minefield, I haven't got a clue what to do." The team leader of Mike 4, unfortunately he was another one of my colleagues to be killed in a later incident, obviously wasn't very happy, but we put the SOPs in place. And the day of the incident, not long before the incident happened, Chris turned to me and he said, "Well, if anything happens, at least you're here, Doc." Because all of the guys were really happy that we actually had some medical SOPs in place. They didn't want to say anything because they didn't want to make any trouble. I was standing about 80 to 100 meters away when the incident happened, and I felt the blast wave on my back. And as you can imagine, I heard the explosion. So this is Chris's injuries. Both arms, both legs. We're on a beach. We're in the middle of a minefield. And unfortunately, because of the size of the explosion, the lanes that we had marked that were meant to be safe, we couldn't really see them anymore. So we went into the minefield, and I had to run the 80 to 100 meters or so to get my aid bag out of the vehicle, and then follow another group of guys to go and get Chris out. We found him lying face down in the sand, couldn't see his face. We did our blood sweep, and we immediately applied digital pressure. In other words, we put our hands in his holes to stop him from bleeding. We placed him on a stretcher, and we kept him in what's called a modified prone position. In other words, we know the massive hemorrhage is an issue, but airway follows really closely with it. And it was going to be very difficult to manage his airway, especially if I turned him on his back. So we kind of propped him up, kind of on his side, to keep his airway open. I'm going to take you through the Marsh process. To be honest, then it was kind of CABC, which we kind of know more here. So, bilateral, effectively amputations or degloving injuries. We used direct pressure, and what we did, we packed wounds with dressings. So what we have to do, remember, no combat gauze, no standard gauze, just a big bag full of dressings. And this is what we did. This is what we stuffed into the holes. We improvised because that's what we had. We packed them hard, and we packed them tight. Once I was happy that we were managing the bleeding, checked his airway. His airway was open. Actually, he was talking to us. But we were there when it happened, literally yards away. So within seconds, we had fingers and hands and holes applying direct pressure. And we kept the red stuff in. In terms of respirations, well, his airway was clear, he was breathing, and he was wearing a blast vest and the blast helmet, which is what protected his head, what protected his chest. As I said, his arms and his legs were exposed. I thought about it, but I was unable to gain IV access for obvious reasons. He didn't have anywhere to put it. And I wasn't qualified, didn't have the experience to go anywhere else, and we didn't have IO either. Head injury? None. His helmet, despite the fact that the visor had been blown away, had protected his head. And as I said, he was responsive to voice. So the immediate thing we want to do is get out of the minefield, and we want to get him on a helicopter and get him out of there. Thankfully, at that time, people would be listening into radio communications, and they heard us declare that we had an incident, and a civilian contract helicopter that would sit on a helipad all day, literally rotors running. They would just refuel it, and it would sit, and the rotors would be going around. Heard our distress call, and came to pick us up. 10-minute flight to get our patient to hospital. And then once we get him to hospital, he would still have to be transferred by ground ambulance. And one of the things I remember is that when the helicopter came, it literally landed in the street. And as we came out of the minefield, I remember seeing the skid of the helicopter on the curbstone of the road, and then thinking, surely the other one should be on the ground, and it wasn't. Such was the skill of the pilots at that time, and these were ex-Vietnam pilots that had actually been contracted to fly in the conditions in Kuwait as they were at that time. So when we did get to hospital, I had to explain when we transferred the patient into the ambulance that the patient was meant to be on their stomach or on their chest because that was the best way for me to keep his airway open. And during the course of the evacuation, actually he did stop responding. And then when I did put an OPA, an airway in place, he spat it out and he started talking again. So when I eventually handed over my patient, I told them that he suffered a mine blast injury. I showed them the soft tissue trauma to all four of his limbs that were high to junctions. I didn't know if he had any chest injury or not. No radial pulses, well, because of the extent of his injuries, and they wouldn't have been able to locate one anyway. I didn't record a respiration rate, I was just happy that he was breathing. I didn't check his pupils to see if they were equal and reactive to light. I was just happy that he was alert and he was talking to me. Obviously, our treatment was improvised, and we packed wounds using the bandages. The patient was in a modified face-down position because we felt that was the best way to keep his airway open. Eventually, all four of us were pulled off of the patient in the ED. All of my guys, that's myself and 3 other operators, each on a corner, were pulled off by staff. We kept our hands on the patient from literally point of incident in the helicopter, transfer into the ambulance, and final handover into the ED. Chris was later transferred to another hospital, better trauma control. Unfortunately, he died 6 hours later. He had suffered lung injury, pulmonary barrel trauma, but if you'd asked me at that time about tension pneumothorax or hemothorax, I would have probably looked at you blankly, because it wasn't something that was my level at that time. But we did the best with what we had. But what we did do is we did the basics right. And that's what we were taught really well. Certainly during the initial part of my military service, we were taught how to put bandages on really, really well. In fact, we would spend hours at it. And if our instructors weren't happy about what our bandages looked like, we would have to take them off and we would have to start again. Thankfully, the guys that I was with on my team were very well trained also. They knew about keeping the red stuff inside, they knew about wound packing, and they knew about good bandaging, and that's what we did. But we were there when it happened. Arguably, if it took me more time to get to Chris, he would have passed away probably sooner. Basic airway management that was position. We didn't use any fancy airway adjuncts. We just used position, and that was enough to keep his airway open. The next incident involves another anti-personnel blast mine. This time it involved a Gurkha deminer. This time we were out in the middle of the desert. A large expanse of desert that was part of the Southern Triangle, and again the mine's being used to deny area. So to stop the Allies being able to drive up from Saudi and drive straight into Kuwait. We knew where we were going. Most of the time, you can see in that picture there, you could see where the mines were. Unfortunately, sometimes you couldn't see where the mines were. Especially this one here. Here's an example of the PMN, and this is the same operation where the incident happened. That's where these photographs came from. The Gurkha operator was walking into the minefield. He was in a safe lane. Those lanes were meant to be 1 meter wide, but because a time pressure had been put onto us to get the clearance job done. Those lanes had actually been reduced in width. Unfortunately, in the operator's brain, he's still working on the 1 meter width lane. He stepped outside the lane and he functioned a blast mine. Thankfully, or should I say he was lucky, the mine only partially detonated because of the deterioration of the explosive material. Thankfully, his injuries were minimal in terms of the injuries that my previous patient had suffered. Small lacerations to lower limbs, actually both legs, but he had boots on, and he did have his demining blast, I say trousers, they're kind of like a thigh guard, and he also had a protective cover for his genitals, but he did suffer some genital laceration. I was approximately 200 meters away. I was covering 2 sites that were being cleared. I heard the explosion. I saw the EOD officer go into the minefield, and he literally picked this guy up and walked straight out with him. Picked him up in his arms and walked out. And I thought, that's strange. Of course, I started my vehicle and I drove down towards the entry point. I went through my tactical field care, did my blood sweep, and revealed no massive bleeding, just the small lacerations. Airway was open, patient was talking. Chest was clear, he had a blast vest, it had protected his chest. Rate was good, effort was good. Depth, normal. I felt, I looked, I checked his armpits, I packed the back, no injury. His circulation, I assessed it. He had good radial pulses. Dressed the wounds to his legs, but I did miss the scrotal injury. The simple fact that I relied upon the fact that he had this protective suit, so I didn't look that high. I got IV access, and I ran in a litre of normal saline. No traumatic brain injury, he had his helmet on, he was responsive to voice throughout the incident. The helivac was requested, it came, and I remember it arriving really, really quickly. Again, they were listening to the call. As soon as the emergency call went out, these guys arrived on scene. So in terms of the mist, there wasn't really much of a mist to give. Mechanism of injury, being the blast injury from the mine, there was a helicopter a paramedic on the helicopter at this time. And that wasn't usual. So I was expecting I was going to have to get on the helicopter and go back to the hospital, but that didn't happen. So in terms of airway, respiration, circulation, head injury, there's nothing else for me to report. And it was a 15-minute flight for him to get to hospital. And we actually went in to see him the next day. He was okay, he was able to walk, and he was discharged nearly a week later. And he went back to work. In comparison to the previous one, this guy was very, very lucky. So he suffered minor injuries. The mine had not functioned as it normally would. He was discharged from hospital after only a few days. But again, I didn't record the vital signs. I missed his genital wounds. I ran IV fluids. In other words, I banged in a litre of normal saline when it wasn't needed, because I didn't understand at that time that over-perfusing patients could blow off blood clots. But treatment was rapid. We were there when it happened, and evacuation was very quick. The last one, unfortunately, involved 5 EOD operators, and they all lost their lives. So this was a routine task, something that happened in Kuwait often, where we would fill the back of a truck with sand. And then munitions that had been involved already in an explosion that were potentially unstable, we would pick them up, we would put them in the back of the truck, we would drive a short distance with the truck, then we would unload them again, and we would put them in a big pile, and we would blow them up. Nice and safe. In this particular incident, it was an ammunition store. These look very similar to aircraft hangars, that's because they were, but that's what the Iraqis were using to store munitions. And there were various munitions, so it wasn't just mines. We're talking shells, we're talking large aerial bombs. All of those things were put in these hangars, and as you can see, the Allies came along, put holes in the roofs to obviously render them safe. As I said, various ordnance was collected, loaded into the back of the truck. Unfortunately, ammunition, it was believed to be a primed mortar bomb. And what we did discover is that the Iraqis would actually screw detonators into the munitions when they stored them. And then all they would do is leave the safety pin in place. As you can imagine, when it's been an explosion, it might not function, but it makes it extremely unstable. Unfortunately, there were other munitions on the back of the truck. In fact, it was pretty much fully loaded from what we know. And dropping that bomb set off all of the other munitions. I certainly remember when I arrived on scene, thinking, where's the truck? All I could see, or I remember seeing, was the engine block sat in the middle of the road, no truck. I don't have pictures for this one. I've got a map, and I'm trying to recall it as best I possibly can. So where you see the yellow blast, that's where the truck was. You can see the bodies. I put a red X next to them. The other red X's are the rest of the bodies, or the bits. But unfortunately, those bits were mixed in amongst other unexploded ordnance. The guy with the green tick is the only survivor of the incident. He was in a vehicle directly behind the truck when it exploded. The helicopter with the two people in white coats, that's the first medic to arrive on scene with the EOD supervisor. And when we arrived on scene, the heli medic and one of my team medics was performing CPR on this operator. At that time, we'd heard a major incident being called on the radio, and we were what's called X-ray call signs. So all medical call signs were X-ray. We were told to go to this ammunition dump immediately. At that time, I was approximately 25 kilometers away, and as the senior medic amongst the medical team, the expectation would be that I would have to take charge once I arrived. When I arrived, as I mentioned, the Air Log, that was the company that was providing the helicopters, were already on scene, and one medic with a helicopter medic performing CPR on the team leader. The one survivor was found uninjured in the vehicle behind the truck, unable to move, in shock, but no injuries. And after a quick scene size up, we saw that there are obviously bodies or bits of bodies strewn everywhere. We requested further EOD assistance because we quickly understood it was not safe for us to go and check. So we had 4 casualties with catastrophic amputations to all limbs, 1 with a penetrating head injury and 1 with no injury. Obviously the 4 don't count in terms of airway, respiration and circulation. Our UK EOD officer with the penetrating head injury, it was a mortal wound. CPR was in progress. The other uninjured, he was relatively normal. As I said, he was shocked, he was in the vehicle behind. The helicopter departed, don't know why. Nobody said anything about it, it just did. The patient they were doing CPR on was just thrown literally in the back of the helicopter and they carried on. I lost one of my medics in the process because he stayed with that patient doing CPR. The patient behind, who was uninjured, he was moved from the vehicle, he was given a cigarette I don't know if he smoked or not, but he was given a cigarette anyway. And then he was taken back to camp. CPR continued until arrival to hospital on a head-injured patient. Unfortunately, that casualty was declared dead on arrival. In the missed report, the explosion was the mechanism of injury with the dropped munition. 4 injuries not compatible with life, one of those being the traumatic brain injury. Again, unfortunately that wasn't compatible with life. Treatment, CPR and a cigarette, because there wasn't anything to put bandages on. So the outcome was we had a major incident that involved 6 persons. How was 6 persons a major incident? It's because it just totally outstripped what we were capable of. We were not equipped to deal with that kind of incident and that number of casualties, especially when the area was extremely unsafe and there was unexploded ordnance mixed in with body parts. No communication between myself and the helicopter crew. Personally, it was extremely stressful. As you can imagine, it's a harrowing scene. These are guys you meet up with first thing in the morning. Everybody gets their mission brief. Everybody knows what's happening for that day. You say goodbye to each other and off you go to your jobs. Unfortunately, those guys were not going to be coming home at the end of the day. One of the medics came to me and said, "Tim, what shall I do with this guy in the vehicle at the back?" And I'm like, "What's wrong with him?" And he said, "Well, nothing. Shall I give him morphine?" I mean, do you give morphine to someone who's got nothing wrong with him? Take him out of the truck, get him out of the way, sit him down, give him a cigarette, and let's get him back to camp. And that's exactly what we did. We had to wait for further explosive ordnance disposal officers to arrive to clear the scene so that we could gain access to the body parts. That task was put on us as the medics. You're the medic, you clear up the body parts. And those body parts, unfortunately, were mixed in with rubble, metal that's used to reinforce concrete, and the recovery task itself was again extremely stressful, but extremely difficult. Before I end, when we took the patients to hospital, we had to put them in body bags. And the body bags that we had were kind of made of plastic, but they didn't like extremes of temperature. So the vulcanized seams where the zips were attached would come apart. And again, I remember when we were unloading the bodies at the morgue, there was a huge crowd of people behind the vehicle pulling at the stretcher. So crowd control when we got to this morgue, because people want to know what's going on, who's been injured, who's been killed, wasn't very good at all. And as they pulled one of the stretchers at the back of my vehicle, one of the body bags split, and the contents of the body bag spilled out into the inside of my vehicle, which we then had to clear up again, put back in another body bag so that it could be taken into the morgue. That's my recollection of those incidents. I'm still doing medicine. So I'm 51, at least I was 51 a couple of days ago. And no matter how hard I try to leave medicine, it still pulls me back. And I'm trying to pass on my experiences so that other people don't have to go through some of the things that I had to go through, so that we can use the improved techniques and the much improved knowledge that we have about trauma medicine so that our medics are better equipped when they end up in the battlefield. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Tim, for the presentation. We have a few questions for you, and a few last 2 minutes of your time. For the first patient you mentioned, for the first scenario, wasn't there any heavy machinery to clear the beach out?
After the incident.
Okay.
So the answer is yes. It was unproven technology at that time. And actually, when we had the incident with Chris in the minefield, they stopped beach clearance operations by using operators, and they started to use tracked vehicles.
How did you end up in the military, in the army? Was your goal to end up as a combat medic?
I like the idea of being a medic. Primarily, I wanted to be a paratrooper, and I was in the, I guess what's called the cadets. So when I was at school, I went to the military cadets, and my mum went to the recruiting office because she didn't want me staying at home when I left school, and she said I needed to get a job. So my mum got me an interview. I went for the interview because it was a day off school, and I basically ended up in the army because of my mum.
Okay. How did it's mostly the moms are like the first one against, so it's kind of weird. But how did you end up here in Czech Republic? How did it happen?
I came on holiday and I stayed.
And you just like...
That's it, pure and simple.
Okay.
I hate to say it, I made my Brexit about 10 years ago.
At least someone from England did it.
I escaped.
Did you consider to give some? I think it should be like medical English term courses.
So, I'm the company owner and training director of Paramed CZ. We are a training company here based in the Czech Republic. We are part of the Medivac group, and we deliver courses in English and in Czech as well. We can do them in German, we can do them in Polish. Any other languages we do? Slovak, we can do it in Slovak. So yeah, whatever your needs are, we will do our best to meet them when it comes to medical training.
Do you know how much does it cost to remove the line?
I could never put a price on it. I think at that time, people just wanted the job done. And obviously because we're military, it's already kind of paid for. So the cost was more about time than it was about money. And again, being in the military at that time, you have no concept of what things cost. But these things would be millions and millions of dollars.
Have you ever asked yourself, why am I doing that?
A lot. Every time I kind of attend one of these incidents, or every time afterwards when I'm decompressing and trying to reset my mind, I'm thinking to myself, why do I do this again? And then I kind of get over it. Like I said, I've been trying to leave medicine for like well over 30 years, and it won't let me go.
What was the first thing went through your head during the third scenario, the third casuistic?
What should I do now? What can I do that's going to make a difference? I can quickly see that at least 4 of the injuries, and I couldn't tell you whether there was 4 or 10 or whatever. I really didn't know how many people were there at that time. I had to find that information out. So it was quickly obvious that what we could do was going to be limited. Anything we did do was most likely going to mean that we would get injured in the process. In terms of the EOD officer that was having CPR done on him, that was kind of taken out of my hands because it was already happening. I do remember thinking, how did the helicopter get there? He shouldn't land there. But he did, and then he left.
How often were mines secured against lifting?
Say again, sorry.
The last one. How often were mines secured against the lifting?
So, again, it depended on the render safe procedure. If you could access the mine, and each mine has a different render safe procedure, if you could render it safe, then we would remove the detonators, we would put all of the explosive part in one pile, usually put the detonators in another pile, and we would blow them all up together. If you couldn't follow the render safe procedure, then you would blow them in situ. The team leader of Mike 4, I mentioned to you, he died as well, unfortunately, later on during the tour. And he died after I gave him a pair of my artery forceps, which were used to grip the second detonator in the VS69. Because there were 2 detonators, one in the top and one in the main body. And the idea was is you would pin the crown, unscrew it, take it off, So that's one detonator goal. Then you would take the body of the mine, fold it up the other way, and the second detonator should drop out into your hand. It was common practice, unfortunately, for the EOD officers to use artery forceps. If that didn't happen, grip the detonator and pull it out. Unfortunately, he gripped it, functioned it, and blew himself up.
Okay. When you get back home from the operation, have you ever need to use a psychological care or chaplain or?
Yes. If anything, this is therapy right now, so thank you very much. The fact that I get to talk about it and share it is really important. You can't keep these things to yourselves. And these are harrowing scenes, especially when it's people you've literally just had a conversation with moments before. So absolutely. When I got back to the UK, I found it extremely difficult acclimatizing to normal life. Thankfully, I had a good support network, obviously my wife and my family, and a general practitioner, and I used the services that were available. And thankfully, I'm here to talk about it and share it with you.
Thank you too. Jsme vyčerpali dotazy. That's all from the discussion.
Thank you very much.
Questions. We thank you too, again.